Chapter 11 of Nobody's Boy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Nobody's Boy by Hector Malot. Translated by Florence Crew Jones. Chapter 11 Another Boy's Mother. Arthur's mother was English. Her name was Mrs. Milligan. She was a widow, and Arthur was her only son. At least it was supposed that he was her only living son, for she had lost an elder child under mysterious conditions. When the child was 6 months old it had been kidnapped, and they had never been able to find any trace of him. It is true that at the time he was taken, Mrs. Milligan had not been able to make the necessary searches. Her husband was dying, and she herself was dangerously ill, and knew nothing of what was going on around her. When she regained consciousness her husband was dead, and her baby had disappeared. Her brother-in-law, Mr. James Milligan, had searched everywhere for the child. There being no heir, he expected to inherit his brother's property. Yet, after all, Mr. James Milligan inherited nothing from his brother, for 7 months after the death of her husband, Mrs. Milligan's second son Arthur was born. But the doctors said that this frail, delicate child could not live. He might die at any moment. In the event of his death, Mr. James Milligan would succeed to the fortune. He waited and hoped, but the doctor's predictions were not fulfilled. Arthur lived. It was his mother's care that saved him. When he had to be strapped to a board, she could not bear the thought of her son being closed up in a house, so she had a beautiful barge built for him, and was now traveling through France on the various canals. Naturally, it was not the first day that I learned all this about the English lady and her son. I learned these details little by little while I was with her. I was given a tiny cabin on the boat. What a wonderful little room it appeared to me! Everything was spotless. The only article of furniture that the cabin contained was a bureau. But what a bureau! Bed, mattress, pillows, and covers combined. And attached to the bed were drawers containing brushes, combs, etc. There was no table or chairs, at least not in the usual shape. But against the wall was a plank, which when pulled down was found to be a little square table and chair. How pleased I was to get into that little bed! It was the first time in my life that I had felt soft sheets against my face. Mother Barberin's were very hard, and they used to rub my cheeks. And Vitalis and I had often slept without sheets, and those at the cheap lodging houses at which we stayed were just as rough as Mother Barberin's. I woke early, for I wanted to know how my animals had passed the night. I found them all at the place where I had installed them the night before, and sleeping as though the beautiful barge had been their home for several months. The dogs jumped up as I approached, but Pretty Heart, although he had one eye half open, did not move. Instead, he commenced to snore like a trombone. I guessed at once what was the matter. Pretty Heart was very sensitive. He got angry very quickly, and sulked for a long time. In the present circumstances he was annoyed, because I had not taken him into my cabin, and he showed his displeasure by pretending to be asleep. I could not explain to him why I had been forced to leave him on deck, and as I felt that I had, at least in appearances, done him an injury, I took him in my arms and cuddled him to show him that I was sorry. At first he continued to sulk, but soon, with his changeable temper, he thought of something else, and by his signs made me understand that if I would take him for a walk on land he would perhaps forgive me. The man who was cleaning the deck was willing to throw a plank across for us, and I went off to the fields with my troop. The time passed, playing with the dogs and chasing Pretty Heart. When we returned the horses were harnessed and the barge in readiness to start. As soon as we were all on the board the horses began to trot along the towing path. We glided over the water without feeling a movement, and the only sound to be heard was the song of the birds, the swish of the water against the boat, and the tinkle of bells around the horses' necks. Here and there the water seemed quite black, as though it was of great depths. In other parts it was as crystal clear, and we could see the shiny pebbles and velvety grass below. I was gazing down into the water when I heard someone call my name. It was Arthur. He was being carried out on his board. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Better than in the field?" I told him that I had, after I had politely spoken to Mrs. Milligan. "And the dogs?" asked Arthur. I called to them. They came running with Pretty Heart, the latter making grimaces, as he usually did when he thought that we were going to give a performance. Mrs. Milligan had placed her son in the shade, and had taken a seat beside him. "Now," she said to me, "you must take the dogs and monkey away. We are going to work." I went with the animals to the front of the boat. What work could that poor little boy do? I looked round, and saw that his mother was making him repeat a lesson from a book she held in her hand. He seemed to be having great difficulty in mastering it, but his mother was very patient. No, she said at last. Arthur, you don't know it at all. I can't, Mamma. I just can't, he said plaintively. I'm sick. Your head is not sick. I can't allow you to grow up in utter ignorance because you are an invalid, Arthur. That seemed very severe to me, yet she spoke in a sweet, kind way. Why do you make me so unhappy? You know how I feel when you won't learn. I cannot, Mamma, I cannot. And he began to cry. But Mrs. Milligan did not let herself be won over by his tears, although she appeared touched and even more unhappy. I would have liked to have let you play this morning with Remi and his dogs, she said, but you cannot play until you know your lessons perfectly. With that she gave the book to Arthur and walked away, leaving him alone. From where I stood I could hear him crying. How could his mother, who appeared to love him so much, be so severe with the little poor fellow? A moment later she returned. "Shall we try again?" she asked gently. She sat down beside him. Taking the book, she began to read a fable called "The Wolf and the Sheep." She read it through 3 times, then gave the book back to Arthur and told him to learn it alone. She went inside the boat. I could see Arthur's lips moving. He certainly was trying very hard, but soon he took his eyes off the book. His lips stopped moving. His look wandered everywhere, but not back to his book. Suddenly he caught my eye. I made a sign to him to go on with his lesson. He smiled as though to thank me for reminding him, and again fixed his eyes on the book. But as before, he could not concentrate his thoughts. His eyes began to rove from one side of the canal to the other. Just then a bird flew over the boat, swiftly as an arrow. Arthur raised his head to follow its flight. When it had passed, he looked at me. "I can't learn this," he said, "and yet I want to." I went over to him. "It is not very difficult," I said. "Yes, it is. It's awfully difficult." "It seems to me quite easy. I was listening while your mother read it, and I almost learned it myself." He smiled as though he did not believe it. "Do you want me to say it to you? You can't." "Shall I try? You take the book." He took up the book again, and I began to recite the verse. I had it almost perfect. "What? Do you know it?" "Not quite, but next time I could say it without a mistake, I believe." "How did you learn it?" "I listened while your mother read it, but listened attentively, without looking about to see what was going on around me." He reddened and turned away his eyes. "I will try like you," he said, "but tell me, what did you do to remember the words?" I did not quite know how to explain, but I tried my best. "What is the fable about?" I said. "Sheep. Well, first of all, I thought of a sheep. The sheep were in a field. I could see them lying down and sleeping in the field. Picturing them so, I didn't forget." "Yes, yes," he said, "I can see them, black and white ones, in a green field. What looks after the sheep usually?" "Dogs." "And?" "A shepherd." If they thought the sheep were quite safe, what did they do? The dog slept while the shepherd played his flute in the distance with the other shepherds. Little by little, Arthur had the entire fable pictured in his mind's eye. I explained every detail as well as I was able. When he was thoroughly interested, we went over the lines together, and at the end of half an hour he had mastered it. "Oh, how pleased Mamma will be!" he cried. When his mother came out, she seemed displeased that we were together. She thought that we had been playing. But Arthur did not give her time to say a word. "I know it," he cried. "Remi has taught it to me." Mrs. Milligan looked at me in surprise. But before she could say a word, Arthur had commands to recite the fable. I looked at Mrs. Milligan. Her beautiful face broke into a smile. Then I thought I saw tears in her eyes. But she bent her head quickly over her son and put her arms about him. I was not sure if she was crying. "The words mean nothing," said Arthur. "They are stupid. But the things that one sees. Remi made me see the shepherd with his flute, and the fields, and the dogs, and the sheep, then the wolves, and I could even hear the music that the shepherd was playing. Shall I sing the song to you, Mamma?" And he sang a little sad song in English. This time Mrs. Milligan did really cry, for when she got up from her seat, I saw that Arthur's cheeks were wet with her tears. Then she came to me, and taking my hand in hers, pressed it gently. "You are a good boy," she said. The evening before, I had been a little tramp who had come on the barge with his animals to amuse a sick child. But this lesson drew me apart from the dogs and the monkey. I was for now a companion, almost a friend, to the sick boy. From that day there was a change in Miss Milligan's manner toward me, and between Arthur and myself there grew a strong friendship. I never once felt the difference in our positions. This may have been due to Mrs. Milligan's kindness, for she often spoke to me as though I were her child. When the country was interesting, we would go very slowly. But if the landscape was dreary, the horses would trot quickly along the towing path. When the sun went down, the barge stopped. When the sun rose, the barge started on again. If the evenings were damp, we went into the little cabin and sat around a bright fire, so that the sick boy should not feel chilly, and Mrs. Milligan would read to us and show us pictures and tell us beautiful stories. Then, when the evenings were beautiful, I did my part. I would take my harp, and when the boat had stopped, I would get off and go at a short distance and sit behind a tree. Then, hidden by the branches, I played and sang my best. On calm nights, Arthur liked to hear the music without being able to see who played. And when I played his favorite airs, he would call out, "Encore!" and I would play the piece over again. That was a beautiful life for the country boy who had sat by Mother Barberin's fireside and who had tramped the high roads with Signor Vitalis. What a difference between the dish of boiled potatoes that my poor foster mother had given me and the delicious tarts, jellies, and creams that Mrs. Milligan's cook made! What a contrast between the long tramps in the mud, the pouring rain, the scorching sun, trudging behind Vitalis, and this ride on the beautiful barge! The pastry was delicious, and yes, it was fine, oh so fine not to be hungry, nor tired, nor too hot, nor too cold. But in justice to myself, I must say that it was the kindness and love of this lady and this little boy that I felt the most. Twice I had been torn from those I loved. First from dear Mother Barberin, and then from Vitalis. I was left with only the dogs and the monkey, hungry and footsore, and then a beautiful lady, with a child of about my own age, had taken me in and treated me as though I were a brother. Often, as I looked at Arthur strapped to his bench, pale and drawn, I envied him. I, so full of health and strength, envied a little sick boy. It was not the luxuries that surrounded him that I envied, not the boat, it was his mother. Oh, how I wanted a mother of my own! She kissed him, and he was able to put his arms around her whenever he wished. This lady whose hand I scarcely dared touch when she held it out to me. And I thought sadly that I should never have a mother who would kiss me, and whom I could kiss. Perhaps one day I should see Mother Barberin again, and that would make me very happy. But I could not call her mother now, for she was not my mother. I was alone. I should always be alone. Nobody's boy. I was old enough to know that one should not expect too much from this world, and I thought that, as I had no family, no father or mother, I should be thankful that I had friends. I was happy, so happy on that barge. But alas, it was not to last long. The day was drawing near for me to take up my old life again. End of chapter 11. Recording by Ellie, July 2010. Chapter 12 of Nobody's Boy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Nobody's Boy by Hector Malot. Translated by Florence Crew Jones. Chapter 12. The Master's Consent. It was all to end, this beautiful trip that I had made on the barge. No nice bed, no nice pastry, no evenings listening to Mrs. Milligan. Ah, no Mrs. Milligan or Arthur. One day I decided to ask Mrs. Milligan how long it would take me to get back to Toulouse. I wanted to be waiting at the prison door when my master came out. When Arthur heard me speak of going back, he began to cry. "I don't want him to go. I don't want Remi to go," he sobbed. I told him that I belonged to Vitalis, and that he had paid a sum of money for me, and that I must return to him the moment he wanted me. I had spoken of my foster parents, but never said that they were not really my father and mother. I felt ashamed to admit that I was a foundling, a child picked up in the streets. I knew how the children from the Foundlings' Hospital had been scorned. It seemed to me that it was the most abject thing in the world to be a foundling. I did not want Mrs. Milligan and Arthur to know. Would they not have turned from me in disdain? "Mamma, we must keep Remi," continued Arthur. "I should be very pleased to keep Remi with us," replied Mrs. Milligan. "We are so fond of him. But there are two things. First, Remi would have to want to stay." "Oh, he does," cried Arthur. "Don't you, Remi? You don't want to go back to Toulouse?" "The second is," continued Mrs. Milligan, "will his master give him up?" "Remi comes first, he comes first," Arthur insisted. Vitalis had been a good master, and I was very grateful for all he had taught me. But there was no comparison between my life with him and that which I should have with Arthur, and at the same time there was also no comparison between the respect I had for Vitalis and the affection which I felt for Mrs. Milligan and her invalid boy. I felt that it was wrong in me to prefer these strangers to my master, but it was so. I loved Mrs. Milligan and Arthur. "If Remi stays with us, it will not be all pleasure," went on Mrs. Milligan. "He would have to do lessons the same as you. He would have to study a great deal. It would not be the free life that he would have in going tramping along the roads. "Ah, you know what I would like," I began. "There, you see, Mamma," interrupted Arthur. "All that we have to do now," continued Mrs. Milligan, "is to get his master's consent. I will write and ask him if he will come here, for we cannot return to Toulouse. I will send him his fare and explain to him the reason why we cannot take the train. I'll invite him here and do hope he will accept. If he agrees to my proposition," added Mrs. Milligan, "I will then make arrangements with your parents, Remi, for of course they must be consulted." "Consult my parents?" "They will tell her what I have been trying to keep secret, that I am a foundling. Then neither Arthur nor Mrs. Milligan would want me. A boy who did not know his own father and mother had been a companion to Arthur." I stared at Mrs. Milligan in affright. I did not know what to say. She looked at me in surprise. I did not dare reply to her question when she asked me what was the matter. Probably thinking that I was upset at the thought of my master coming, she did not insist. Arthur looked at me curiously all evening. I was glad when bedtime came, and I could close myself in my cabin. That was my first bad night on the Swan. What could I do? What say? Perhaps Vitalis would not give me up. Then they would never know the truth. My shame and fear of them finding out the truth was so great that I began to hope that Vitalis would insist upon me staying with him. 3 days later, Mrs. Milligan received a reply to the letter she had sent to Vitalis. He said that he would be pleased to come and see her, and that he would arrive the following Saturday by the 2 o'clock train. I asked permission to go to the station with the dogs and Pretty Heart to meet him. In the morning the dogs were restless, as though they knew that something was going to happen. Pretty Heart was indifferent. I was terribly excited. My fate was to be decided. If I had possessed the courage, I would have implored Vitalis not to tell Mrs. Milligan that I was a foundling, but I felt that I could not utter the word, even to him. I stood on a corner of the railway station, holding my dogs on a leash, with Pretty Heart under my coat, and waited. I saw little of what passed around me. It was the dogs who warned me that the train had arrived. They scented their master. Suddenly there was a tug at the leash. As I was not on my guard, they broke loose. With a bark they bounded forward. I saw them spring upon Vitalis. More sure, although less subtle, than the other two, Capi had jumped straight into his master's arms, while Zerbino and Dulce jumped at his feet. When Vitalis saw me, he put Capi down quickly and threw his arms around me. For the first time he kissed me. "God bless you, my boy," he said again and again. My master had never been hard with me, but neither had he ever been affectionate, and I was not used to these effusions. I was touched, and the tears came to my eyes, for I was in the mood when the heart is easily stirred. I looked at him. His stay in prison had aged him greatly. His back was bent, his face paler, and his lips bloodless. "You find me changed, don't you, Remi?" he said. "I was none too happy in prison, but I'll be better now I'm out." Then, changing the subject, he added, "Tell me about this lady who wrote to me. How did you get to know her?" I told him how I met Mrs. Milligan and Arthur in their barge, the Swan, on the canal, and of what we had seen and what we had done. I rambled along, hardly knowing what I said. Now that I saw Vitalis, I felt that it would be impossible to tell him that I wanted to leave him and stay with Mrs. Milligan. We reached the hotel where Mrs. Milligan was staying before my story was ended. Vitalis had not mentioned what she proposed to him in her letter, so I said nothing of her plan. "Is this lady expecting me?" he asked as we entered the hotel. "Yes, I'll take you up to her apartment," I said. "There is no occasion for that," he replied. "I'll go up alone. You wait here for me with Pretty Heart and the dogs." I had always obeyed him, but in this case I felt that it was only fair for me to go up with him to Mrs. Milligan's apartment. But with a sign he stopped the words on my lips, and I was forced to stay below with the dogs. Why didn't he want me to be present when he spoke to Mrs. Milligan? I asked myself this question again and again. I was still pondering over it when he returned. "Go and say good-bye to the lady," he said briefly. "I'll wait for you here. We shall go in 10 minutes." I was thunderstruck. "Well," he said, "didn't you understand me? You stand here like a stupid. Hurry up." He had never spoken so roughly to me. Mechanically I got up to obey, not seeming to understand. "What did you say to her?" I asked after I had gone a few steps. "I said that I needed you and that you needed me, and consequently I was not going to give up my rights to you. Go. I'll give you 10 minutes to say good-bye." I was so possessed by the fact that I was a foundling that I thought that if I had to leave immediately it was because my master had told them about my birth. Upon entering Mrs. Milligan's apartment, I found Arthur in tears and his mother bending over him. "You won't go, Remi. "Oh, Remy, tell me you won't go," he sobbed. I could not speak. Mrs. Milligan replied for me, telling Arthur that I had to do as I was told. "Signor Vitalis would not consent to let us have you," said Mrs. Milligan in a voice so sad. "He is a wicked man," cried Arthur. "No, he is not a wicked man," continued Mrs. Milligan. "He loves you, and he needs you. He speaks like a man far above his position. He told me, let me see, these were his words: 'I love that child, and he loves me. The apprenticeship in the life I give him is good for him, better, far better than he would have with you. You can give him an education, that is true. You would form his mind, but not his character. It is the hardships of life that alone can do that. He cannot be your son, he will be mine. That is better than to be a plaything for your sick child, however sweet he may be. I also will teach the boy.'" "But he isn't Remy's father," cried Arthur. "That is true, but he is his master, and Remy belongs to him. For the time being, Remy must obey him. His parents rented him to Signor Vitalis, but I will write to them and see what I can do." "Oh, no, no, don't do that," I cried. "What do you mean?" "Oh, no, please don't." "But that is the only thing to do, my child. Oh, please, please don't." If Mrs. Milligan had not spoken of my parents, I should have taken much more than the 10 minutes to say good bye that my master had given me. "They live in Chavanon, do they not?" asked Mrs. Milligan. Without replying, I went up to Arthur, and putting my arms around him, clung to him for a moment. Then, freeing myself from his weak clasp, I turned and held out my hand to Mrs. Milligan. "Poor child," she murmured, kissing me on the forehead. I hurried to the door. "Arthur, I will love you always," I said, choking back my sobs. "And I never, never will forget you, Mrs. Milligan." "Remy, Remy!" cried Arthur. I closed the door. 1 moment later I was with Vitalis. "Off we go," he said. And that was how I parted from my first boy friend. End of chapter 12. Recording by Ellie, July 2010.
Chapter 13 of Nobody's Boy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by L.T. Nobody's Boy by Hector Malot. Translated by Florence Crew Jones. Chapter 13. Weary, dreary days. Again I had to tramp behind my master with the harp strapped to my shoulder, through the rain, the sun, the dust, and the mud. I had to play the fool and laugh and cry in order to please the distinguished audience. More than once in our long walks I lagged behind to think of Arthur, his mother, and the swan. When I was in some dirty village, how I would long for my pretty cabin on the barge. And how rough the sheets were now. It was terrible to think that I should never again play with Arthur, and never hear his mother's voice. Fortunately, in my sorrow, which was very deep, I had one consolation. Vitalis was much kinder than he had ever been before. His manner with me had quite changed. I felt that he was more to me than a master now. Often, if I dared, I would have embraced him, I so needed love. But I had not the courage, for Vitalis was not a man with whom one dared be familiar. At first it had been fear that kept me at a distance, but now it was something vague, which resembled a sentiment of respect. When I left the village, I had looked upon Vitalis the same as the other men of the poorer class. I was not able to make distinctions, but the 2 months that I had lived with Mrs. Milligan had opened my eyes and developed my intelligence. Looking at my master with more attention, it seemed to me that in manner and bearing he appeared to be very superior. His ways were like Mrs. Milligan's ways. Weeks passed. In our tramps now, my eyes were always turned in the direction of the water, not to the hills. I was always hoping that one day I should see the swan. If I saw a boat in the distance, I always thought that it might be the swan, but it was not. We passed several days at Lyons, and all my spare time I spent on the docks, looking up and down the river. I described the beautiful barge to the fishermen and asked them if they had seen it, but no one had seen it. We had to leave Lyons at last and went on to Dijon. Then I began to give up hope of ever seeing Mrs. Milligan again, for at Lyons I had studied all the maps of France, and I knew that the swan could not go further up the river to reach the Loire. It would branch off at Chalons. We arrived at Chalons, and we went on again without seeing it. It was the end of my dream. To make things worse, the winter was now upon us, and we had to tramp along wearily in the blinding rain and slush. At night, when we arrived at a wretched inn or in a barn, tired out, wet to the skin, I could not drop off to sleep with laughter on my lips, and Pretty Heart was as sad and mournful as myself. My master's object was to get to Paris as quickly as possible, for it was only in Paris that we had a chance to give performances during the winter. We were making very little money now, so we could not afford to take the train. After the cold sleet, the wind turned to the north. It had been very damp for several days. At first, we did not mind the biting north wind in our faces, but soon the sky was filled with great black clouds and the wintry sun disappeared altogether. We knew that a snowstorm was coming. Vitalis was anxious to get to the next big town, where we could stay and give several performances if very bad weather overtook us. "Go to bed quickly," he said when we got to an inn that night. "We are going to start at a very early hour tomorrow because I don't want to be caught in a snowstorm." He did not go to bed at once, but sat down by a corner of the kitchen fire to warm Pretty Heart, who was suffering terribly from the cold. The monkey had not ceased moaning, although we had wrapped him up in plenty of coverlets. The next morning I got up early as I had been told. It was not yet day, the sky was lowering and black, and there was not a star to be seen. When we opened the door, a strong wind almost took us off our feet. "If I were in your place," said the innkeeper to Vitalis, "I wouldn't venture out. We're going to have a terrible snowstorm." "I'm in a hurry," replied Vitalis, "and I want to get to Troyes before it comes on." 30 miles. Nevertheless, we started. Vitalis held Pretty Heart tight against his body so as to give him some of his own warmth, and the dogs, pleased with the hard, dry roads, raced before us. My master had bought a sheepskin for me at Dijon, and I wrapped myself up in it with the wool inside. It was anything but agreeable when we opened our mouths, so we walked along in silence, hurrying as much to get warm as to get ahead. Although it was long past the hour of daybreak, the sky was still quite black. Although to the east a whitish band cut the clouds, yet the sun would not come out. Looking across the country, objects were now becoming more distinct. We could see the trees stripped of their leaves, and the shrubs and bushes with dry foliage rustling and cracking with the heavy gusts of wind. There was no one on the roads, nor in the fields, not a sound of cartwheels, nor a crack of a whip. Suddenly, in the distance, we could see a pale streak which got larger and larger as it came towards us. Then we heard a sort of hissing murmur, the strange harsh cry of the wild geese. The maddened flock flew over our heads. On they went, wildly fleeing from the north toward the south. Before they were out of sight, soft flakes were dropping gently from the skies and floating in the atmosphere. The country through which we had tramped was desolate and bleak. The mournful aspect seemed to add to the silence. Only the shrill whistling of the north wind was heard. Snowflakes like tiny butterflies fluttered around us, whirling incessantly without touching the ground. We made very little headway. It seemed impossible that we could reach Troyes before the storm was finally upon us, but I did not worry. I thought that if the snow fell, it would not be so cold. I did not know what a snowstorm could be. It was not long before I learned, and in a way that I shall never forget. The clouds were gathering from the northwest. The flakes no longer hovered in the air, but fell straight and swift, covering us from head to foot. "We shall have to take shelter in the first house we come to," murmured Vitalis. "We cannot make Troyes." I was pleased to hear him say that, but where could we find shelter? As far as the eye could reach, there was not a house to be seen, nor anything to indicate that we were nearing a village. Before us lay a forest with its dark depths, and on either side of us the hills. The snow came down faster and thicker. We tramped in silence. My master lifted his sheepskin now and again for Pretty Heart to breathe more easily. From time to time we had to turn our heads to one side so that we could also breathe. The dogs no longer raced ahead. They walked at our heels, asking for the shelter that we were unable to give them. We went slowly and painfully on, blinded, wet and frozen, and although we were now in the heart of the forest, the road through it was exposed to the full wind. Several times I saw my master glance to the left, as though he were looking for something, but he said nothing. What did he hope to find? I looked straight before me, down the long road. As far as my eye could reach, I could see nothing but woods on either side. I thought that we should never come to the end of the forest. I had seen the snow falling only through the window panes of a warm kitchen. How far off that warm kitchen seemed now! Our feet sunk into the white bed of snow deeper and deeper. Then, suddenly, without saying a word, Vitalis pointed to the left. I looked and saw indistinctly a little hut made of branches. We had to find the track that led to the hut. This was difficult, for the snow was already thick enough to efface all trace of a path. We scrambled through the bushes, and after crossing a ditch, we managed at last to reach the hut and get inside. The dogs, in ecstasy, rolled over and over on the dry ground, barking. Our satisfaction was no less keen than theirs. "I thought there would be a woodcutter's cabin somewhere in the forest," said Vitalis. "Now it can snow." "Yes, let it snow," I said defiantly. "I don't care." I went to the door, or rather to the opening of the hut, for there was neither door nor window, and shook my coat and hat so as not to wet the inside of our apartment. Our quarters were very simply but strongly built. Its furniture consisted of a heap of dirt and some big stones for seats. In a house like this, it was not difficult to find fuel. We only had to take it down from the walls and the roof, dragging out a few faggots here and there. This was quickly done, and soon we had a bright flaming fire. It is true that the hut was soon filled with smoke, but what did that matter? There was a flame, and it was heat that we wanted. I lay down, supporting myself on my 2 hands, and blew the fire. The dogs sat around the grate gravely. With necks stretched out, they presented their wet sides to the flames. Pretty Heart soon ventured to peep from under Vitalis's coat. Prudently putting the end of his nose outside, he looked about to take in his surroundings. Evidently satisfied, he jumped quickly to the ground, and taking the best place before the fire, he held out his 2 little trembling hands to the flames. That morning, before I had risen, Vitalis had packed some provisions. There was some bread and a piece of cheese. We all expressed satisfaction at the sight of the food. Unfortunately, we were only able to have a very small piece, for not knowing how long we should have to stay in the hut, Vitalis thought it advisable to keep some for supper. I understood, but the dogs did not, and when they saw the bread put back in the bag before they had scarcely eaten, they held out their paws to their master, scratching his neck and performing pantomime gestures to him to open the bag upon which their eyes were fixed. But Vitalis took no notice of them. The bag was not opened. The dogs settled themselves to go to sleep, Cappy with his nose in the cinders. I thought that I would follow their example. I do not know how long I slept. When I awoke, the snow had stopped falling. I looked outside. It was very deep. If we ventured out, it would come above our knees. What time was it? I could not ask Vitalis. His big silver watch, by which Cappy had told the hour, had been sold. He had spent all his money to pay his prison fine, and when he bought my sheepskin at Dijon, he had parted with his big watch to pay for it. From the misty atmosphere, it was impossible for me to tell what hour it might be. There was not a sound to be heard. The snow seemed to have petrified every movement of life. I was standing in the opening of our cabin when I heard my master calling. "Do you want to get on your way?" he asked. "I don't know. I want to do what you wish." "Well, I think we ought to stay here. We are at least sheltered and have warmth." That was true, but I remembered that we had no food. However, I said nothing. "I'm afraid it will snow again," continued Vitalis. "We don't want to spend the night outside. Better stay here." Yes, we should have to stay in the hut and tighten our belts round our stomachs. That was all. At supper, Vitalis divided the remainder of the bread. Alas, there was but little, and it was quickly eaten. We gobbled up every crumb. When our frugal supper was over, I thought that the dogs would begin making signs for more as they had done before, for they were ravenous. But they did nothing of the kind, and once again I realized how great was their intelligence. When Vitalis thrust his knife into his trouser pocket, which indicated that the feast was over, Cappy got up and smelled the bag in which the food was kept. He then placed his paw on the bag to feel it. This double investigation convinced him that there was nothing left to eat. Then, coming back to his place before the fire, he looked at Zerbino and Dulcie. The look clearly signified that they would get nothing more. Then he stretched himself out his entire length with a sigh of resignation. "There is nothing more. It is useless to beg." He said this to them as plainly as though he had spoken aloud. His companions, understanding this language, also stretched out before the fire, sighing. But Zerbino's sigh in no wise betokened resignation, for added to a large appetite, Zerbino was very much a gourmand, and this was a greater sacrifice for him than for the others. The snow had commenced to fall again. It fell persistently. We could see the white carpet on the ground rise higher and higher until the small shrubs and bushes were hidden beneath it. When night came, big flakes were still falling from the black sky onto the shimmering earth. As we had to sleep there, the best thing to do was go to sleep as quickly as possible. I wrapped myself up in my sheepskin, which I had dried by the fire during the day, and I laid down beside the fire, my head on a flat stone which served for a pillow. "You go to sleep," said Vitalis. "I'll wake you when it's my turn. For although we have nothing to fear from animals or people in this cabin, one of us must keep awake to see that the fire does not go out. We must be careful not to get cold, for it will be bitter when the snow stops." I slept. In the small hours of the night, my master woke me. The fire was still burning, and the snow had stopped falling. "It's my turn to sleep now," said Vitalis. "As the fire goes down, you throw on this wood that I've already got here." He had piled up a heap of small wood by the grate. My master, who slept much lighter than I, did not wish me to wake him by pulling down the wood from the walls each time I needed it. So from this heap that he had prepared, I could take the wood and throw on the fire without making a noise. It was a wise thing to do, but alas, Vitalis did not know what the result would be. He stretched out now before the fire with Pretty Heart in his coverlet cuddled up against him, and soon from his deep breathing I knew that he had fallen asleep. Then I got up softly and went to the opening to see how it looked outside. All the grass, the bushes, and the trees were buried in the snow. Everywhere the eye rested was a dazzling white. The sky was dotted with twinkling stars, but although they were so bright, it was the snow which shed the pale light over the earth. It was much colder now. It was freezing hard. Oh, what should we have done in the depths of the forest in the snow and the cold if we had not found this shelter? Although I had walked on tiptoe to the opening without scarcely making a sound, I had roused the dogs, and Zerbino had followed me. The splendor of the night was nothing to him. He looked on the scene for a moment, and then became bored and wanted to go outside. I ordered him to return to his place. "Foolish dog, wasn't it better to stay by the warm fire in this terrible cold than to go prowling around?" He obeyed me, but with a very bad grace, and kept his eyes fixed on the entrance. I stayed there for a few minutes longer, looking at the white night. It was beautiful, but although I enjoyed it, somehow I felt a vague sadness. I could have gone inside and not looked, of course, but the white mysterious scene held me fascinated. At last I went back to the fire, and having placed 2 or 3 long pieces of wood crossways upon one another, I sat down on the stone which had served me for a pillow. My master was sleeping calmly. The dogs and Pretty Heart also slept, and the flames leaped from the fire and swirled upward to the roof, throwing out bright sparks. The spluttering flame was the only sound that broke the silence of the night. For a long time I watched the sparks, then little by little I began to get drowsy without my being aware. If I had been compelled to busy myself with getting the wood, I could have kept awake, but seated before the fire with nothing to do, I became so sleepy, and yet all the time I thought that I could manage to keep awake. I sprang up suddenly, awakened by a violent barking. It was night. I probably had slept for a long time, and the fire was almost out. No flames lit the hut now. Cappy was barking loudly, furiously. But strange, there was no sound from Zerbino or Dulcie. "What's the matter?" cried Vitalis, waking up. "I don't know." "You've been to sleep, and the fire's gone out." Cappy had run to the opening, but had not ventured outside. He stood on the threshold barking. "What has happened?" I asked in my turn. In answer to Cappy's barks came 2 or 3 mournful howls. I recognized Dulcie's voice. These howls came from behind our hut and at a very short distance. I was going out, but Vitalis put his hand on my shoulder and stopped me. "First," he said in a tone of command, "put some wood on the fire." While I obeyed, he took a sprig from the fire and blew it out until only the point remained burning. He held the torch in his hand. "Come and see what is the matter," he said. "You walk behind me. Go ahead, Cappy." As we went out, there was a frightful howl. Cappy drew back, cowering behind us in terror. "Wolves! Where are Zerbino and Dulcie?" What could I say? The 2 dogs must have gone out while I slept. Zerbino had waited until I was asleep and then had crept out, and Dulcie had followed him. The wolves had gotten hold of them. There was fear in my master's voice when he asked for the dogs. "Take a torch," he said. "We must go to their aid." In our village I had heard them tell terrible stories of wolves, yet I could not hesitate. I ran back for a torch, then followed my master. but outside we could see neither dogs nor wolves. On the snow we could only see the imprint of the 2 dogs' paws. We followed these traces around the hut. Then, at a certain distance, we could see a space in the snow which looked as though some animals had been rolling in it. "Go and look for them, Cappy," said my master. At the same time he whistled to attract Zerbino and Dulcie. But there was no barking in reply. No sound disturbed the mournful silence of the forest, and Cappy, instead of running off as he was told, kept close to us, giving every sign of fear. Cappy, who was usually so obedient and brave. There was not sufficient light for us to follow the imprints any distance. The snow around us was dazzling, but beyond seemed all vague and obscure. Again Vitalis whistled and shouted for the missing dogs. There was no answering bark. "Oh, poor Zerbino! Poor Dulcie!" "The wolves have got them," said Vitalis. "Why did you let them go out?" "Yes, why?" I had nothing to say. "We must go and look for them," I said after a pause. I went before him, but he stopped me. "Where will you look for them?" he asked. "I don't know. Everywhere. We can't tell in this dim light where they have gone." That was true, and the snow came up above our knees. Our 2 torches together could not penetrate the shadows. "If they do not reply, it is because they are a long way off," he said. "We must not go on. The wolves might attack us also. We cannot defend ourselves." It was dreadful to have to leave the poor dogs to their fate, our 2 friends. Friends particularly to me. And the terrible part of it was that I knew that I was responsible. If I had not slept, they would not have gone out. My master had turned back to the hut. I followed, looking back at each step, stopping to listen. I heard nothing and saw nothing but the snow. When we reached the hut, another surprise awaited us. The branches that I had thrown on the fire were aflame and lit up the darkest corners of the cabin, but Pretty Heart was nowhere to be seen. His coverlets were there before the fire, but he was not in them. I called. Vitalis called, but he did not appear. My master said that when he awoke the monkey was beside him, so it was while we were out that he had disappeared. With our burning torches held down to the snowy earth, we started out to look for him. We found no trace of him. We returned to the hut to see if he were hidden behind some faggots. We searched for a long time. 10 times we looked in the same place, the same corners. I climbed up on Vitalis's shoulders to look amongst the branches of which the roof was made. We called out again and again, but there was no answer. Vitalis seemed angry. I was in despair. I asked my master if he thought that the wolves could have taken him also. "No," he said. "The wolves would not dare to come into the hut. I am afraid they got Zerbino and Dulcie when they went out, but they did not come in here. It is quite likely that Pretty Heart was terrified and has hidden himself somewhere while we were outside. That is why I am so anxious. In this terrible weather he will catch cold, and cold is fatal for him. Well, let us keep on looking." We went over the ground again, but all in vain. "We must wait till day," said Vitalis. "When will it be day?" "In 2 or 3 hours, I think." Vitalis sat down before the fire with his head in his hands. I did not dare disturb him. I stood quite close to him, only moving occasionally to put some branches on the fire. Once or twice he got up and went to the door. He looked at the sky, listened attentively, then came back and sat down. I would rather that he had been angry with me than that he should be so silent and sad. The 3 hours passed slowly. It seemed that the night would never end. The stars were fading from the heavens, the sky was getting lighter. Day was breaking, but as morning came the cold grew more intense. The air which came through the door froze us to the bone. If we did find Pretty Heart, would he be alive? The snow had quite stopped falling now, and there was a pinkish light in the sky which foretold fine weather. As soon as it was quite light, Vitalis and I, armed with a stout stick, left the hut. Cappy did not appear so terrified as he had been the night before. With his eyes fixed on his master, he only waited for a sign from him to rush forward. As we were examining the ground for Pretty Heart's footprints, Cappy threw back his head and began to bark joyfully. He signified that we must look up, not on the ground. In the great oak standing by the hut we found him. Poor Pretty Heart. Frightened by the howling of the dogs, he had jumped onto the roof of the cabin when we had gone out, and from there he had climbed to the top of an oak, where, feeling that he was in a safe place, he had remained crouching without replying to our calls. The poor little frail creature, he must be frozen. My master called him gently. He did not move. We thought that he was already dead. For several minutes Vitalis continued to call him, but the monkey gave no sign of life. My heart ached with remorse. How severely I was being punished. I must atone. I'll go up and get him, I said. You'll break your neck. No, there is no danger. I can do it easily. That was not true. There was danger. It was very difficult, for the large tree was covered with ice and snow. When I was quite small, I had learned to climb trees, and I was quite an adept in this art. I jumped and caught hold of the lowest branches. I held on to these, and although blinded by the snow that fell in my eyes, I managed to climb up the trunk to the stronger branches. Once up there, I had only to be careful not to lose my footing. As I climbed, I spoke softly to Pretty Heart. He did not move, but looked at me with shining eyes. I had almost reached him and was about to stretch out my hand, when with a spring he had jumped to another branch. I followed him to this branch, but men, alas, and even youngsters are very inferior to monkeys when it comes to climbing trees. It is quite possible that I should never have caught him if the snow had not wet his feet. He did not like this and soon got tired of dodging me. Then, letting himself drop from branch to branch, he jumped straight onto his master's shoulders and hid himself inside his coat. It was a great thing to have found Pretty Heart, but that was not all. Now we had to look for the dogs. It was day now, and easy for us to see what had happened. In the snow, we read the death of our dogs. We followed their footprints for 30 yards. They had come out of the hut, one behind the other, Dulcie following Zerbino. Then we saw other footprints. On one side there were signs of a struggle where the wolves had sprung upon the dogs, and on the other side were the footprints of the wolves where they had trotted off, carrying their prey with them, to be devoured at their leisure. There was no trace of the dogs except a red trail of blood which here and there stained the snow. The 2 poor dogs had gone to their death while I slept. We had to get busy as quickly as possible with warming Pretty Heart. We hurried back to the hut. Why, Vitalis held out the little creature's feet and hands to the fire, as one holds a tiny baby. I warmed his coverlets and we rolled him up in them. But he needed more than the coverlets. He needed a warm drink. My master and I sat by the fire, silent, watching the wood burn. Poor Zerbino. Poor Dulcie. Each of us murmured these words. First he, then I. The dogs had been our friends, our companions in good and bad fortune. And to me in my loneliness they had meant so much. How deeply I reproached myself for not having kept watch. The wolves would not have come to attack us in our cabin. They would have stayed in the distance, frightened by the fire. If only Vitalis would have scolded me. I wished that he would beat me, but he said nothing. He did not even look at me. He sat with his head bent over the fire, probably wondering what would become of us without the dogs. End of chapter 13.